Let's explore an underrated and exciting gambit to counter white's first move, pawn to e4. We respond with pawn to e5. After white develops their knight with knight to f3 and follows up with bishop to c4, we arrive at a very common setup. At this stage, most players controlling black tend to develop their pieces with moves like knight to c6 or bishop to c5, sticking to classical opening principles. But we're going to take a different and bold approach. Instead of the standard moves, you surprise your opponent with pawn to f5. This gambit immediately challenges white, leading to dynamic and sharp positions. When black plays pawn to f5, most players realize that black's intent is to capture the pawn on e4. Naturally, white will try to address this threat in one of several ways. Many players will either capture the pawn on f5 or protect their pawn on e4 by playing pawn to d3. Others might try to defend the e4 pawn with knight to c3. Surprisingly, none of these moves are correct. The best move for white, though a bit of a spoiler, is pawn to d4. This is the most challenging response. Even in this case, the position remains unclear, and black has plenty of opportunities to create counterplay. Let's examine the most common responses from white, starting with one of the most popular moves, knight to c3. This is actually one of the fastest ways for white to lose. Here's why. After white plays knight to c3, black can capture the pawn on e4 and follow up with pawn to d5. This move creates a double attack on white's two minor pieces, the bishop on c4 and the knight on c3. This puts white in a tough spot and gives black a clear advantage. It's a great way to catch your opponent off guard and quickly seize control of the game. Exploring other options for white now, let's consider some alternatives white might play instead of knight to c3. Capturing the pawn on f5, black has a couple of strong continuations. Option 1. Push the pawn to e4. Attacking the knight on f3 and gaining space in the center. Option 2. Push the pawn to d5, attacking the bishop on c4. This move also opens the diagonal for black's light-squared bishop, allowing it to recapture the pawn on f5. In either case, black rapidly gains control of the board, pushing white's pieces backward while simultaneously expanding their position. If white plays pawn takes f5, which is ironically the most common response, they quickly fall into trouble. Here's why. After white captures the pawn, black can immediately push the pawn to e4, attacking the knight on f3. Surprisingly, the knight on f3 has no good squares to move to. Let's break it down. The central squares, e5 and d4, are controlled by black's knight on c6. The kingside squares, g5 and h4, are controlled by black's queen on d8. This leaves white with a grim realization. Despite the open board, none of the available squares for the knight on f3 are safe. White is forced to retreat the knight all the way back to g1, which is a humiliating and passive move. Once the knight on f3 retreats to g1, black can continue to expand and launch aggressive attacks. At this stage, white might think retreating the knight to g1 is too passive and opt for a seemingly clever move, queen to e2. This move aims to pin black's pawn on e4 to the king on e8, hoping to take advantage of the situation. However, you can easily counter this idea. After white plays queen to e2, black simply responds with queen to e7. A symmetric move that unpins the pawn on e4 and renews the threat of capturing the knight on f3. At this point, white has no choice but to move the knight on f3 backward to g1. The same sad retreat they wanted to avoid. Black can smoothly continue development, play knight to f6, preparing the powerful pawn to d5. This move will kick out white's bishop on c4, further asserting control over the board. Seeing their position deteriorate, most players controlling white will respond with pawn to d3. They do this because the pawn on e4 is a major obstacle. It blocks the development of their knight on f3, so white hopes to trade it off to regain some activity. At this point, there's an incredibly cool move you can execute, one that could catch your opponent completely off guard. It's a tactical idea that can transform your game into a masterpiece. Knight to d4. This move does several things at once. Attacks the queen on e2, forcing it to react. Threatens the pawn on c2, creating the possibility of a devastating fork. The queen on e2 now has to protect the pawn on c2. No matter where the queen moves, as long as it maintains protection, black proceeds with the brilliant move knight takes c2. By capturing the pawn on c2, the knight on c2 creates a fork, attacking both the king on e1 and the rook on a1. White is forced to capture the knight on c2 with their queen, as ignoring it allows black to win the rook on a1. After white plays queen takes c2, black plays pawn takes d3, creating a discovered check against the king on e1. The pawn on d3 also attacks the queen on c2, ensuring black will capture it on the next move. At this point, the position is completely winning for black. White will have lost significant material, and it's time for them to resign. Let's revisit the starting position of this gambit. After white captures the pawn on f5, and you respond by pushing your pawn to e4. They soon realize that the knight on f3 has no safe forward squares. Accepting the situation, white often decides to retreat the knight to g1. One thing you need to be mindful of in this gambit is the slight exposure created along the diagonal when you push your pawn to f5. This diagonal can be exploited by white's potential move, queen to h5, delivering a check to your king on e8. While this check isn't deadly, black can simply ignore it and play pawn to d5. It's usually easier and safer to prevent it altogether. You can stop the threat completely by playing knight to f6 before advancing your pawn to d5. The knight on f6 controls the h5 square, ensuring that white's queen cannot deliver the check. This move delays your central pawn thrust by just one turn, but it doesn't change your overall plan. On the following move, you can comfortably play pawn to d5. Continuing your aggressive expansion in the center, attacking the bishop on c4 while simultaneously opening up the diagonal for your light-squared bishop to recapture the pawn on f5. Once white's bishop on c4 retreats, you capture the pawn on f5 with your bishop, and it becomes evident that black is already dominating the board. Black's pawns and pieces command the central squares, giving you a strong positional edge. White's development is stifled, with many of their pieces still stuck on the back rank. Black's pieces are active and ready to finalize development smoothly. This is why the gambit is so effective. In many games, white tries to regain some footing by capturing in the center with pawn takes e4. In this case, black simply recaptures with the knight on f6, keeping the pressure on and maintaining excellent control of the center. After securing control of the position, black can continue with aggressive and logical development. Black establishes an outpost for the knight on f3, creating a strong presence near white's king. The bishop on c5 comes out, adding pressure to white's position. Let's say white castles kingside, a common response. Black responds by castling kingside. At this stage, it's evident that black is ahead in development, with strong attacking chances on the kingside. The knight, bishop, and potentially the queen and rook are poised for a decisive assault. If white plays knight to d2, one of the most common moves in this position, black has an exciting tactical opportunity. Black sacrifices the knight on f2, exposing white's king. This sacrifice sets up a devastating follow-up. Black plays knight to d4, that creates multiple threats. It attacks the bishop on b2 and the pawn on c2. It works in conjunction with the bishop to pressure white's position further. If white captures the knight on d4, black unleashes a powerful discovered attack with bishop takes c2. This move attacks the queen on d1 while the rook on f8 delivers a discovered check to the king on f2. As a result, black captures the queen and continues attacking the king, leaving white in a completely losing position. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, then subscribe.